What is the creepiest experience that has ever happened to you or somebody else? Serious, NSFW. My mom worked at Tampa General Hospital in the 1980s. On the graveyard shift with like 4 other women and 1 guy. In 1984, a serial killer started a spree during the summer. And his victims were young women. I think they were later discovered to be prostitutes. My mom and her co-workers were all in their 20s at the time. So after one of the murders made the news again, they got really nervous about having to walk back to their cars at the end of their shift. In the middle of the night. So the one male co-worker, Bobby Joe Long, walked them to the parking garage. My mom included. A few weeks later, Long was arrested and charged with all the murders after one of his intended victims escaped. So yeah. That one's a little freaky. Edit, added link. Since a lot of you seem to be interested in who he is, what he did. The doorbell rang late at night. Around 1 while I was watching TV. I went upstairs and looked out the window on the side of the door. Nobody was there. It rang again. I was freaked out and waited a bit. Then stretched up and looked through a window at the top of the door, and there was someone pressed up against the door, huddled in the corner. I freaked and stood still for a minute. I looked up again and I saw a hooded person running away from the house down the street. Doesn't sound like a ding dong bitch to me. Sounds like a strong arm home invasion. Soon as the door starts to open, you'd have been rushed. Told this story before. But wife and I were in a motel room. She was asleep and I was just starting to doze off when I heard a male voice speak just above a whisper. I think they're asleep now. I flew out of bed. Turned on all the lights. Looked in the bathroom. Shower. Under the bed. Behind the curtains. Checked the window. I mean, it was a motel room. Where could someone hide? I realized I had experienced a hypnagogic hallucination. If I had not known about hypnagogic hallucinations, I would have concluded the room was haunted. Told this before. Was forced to give a ride to a criminal one night after getting off work at 2 AM. I was completely alone in an empty parking lot and he approached from behind a building as I opened my car. I offered the car but he didn't want it. He only wanted a ride and the threat was implied. His hands and face were bloody and he said he had just been jumped. I didn't see much choice, so I gave him a ride. It turned out okay, but I called 911 when I got home. Detective came the next day and took a statement. Years later, another detective came to get another statement. Turns out he may have been involved in a robbery murder. So many years had passed I couldn't remember much detail. Don't know what happened after that. Edit, wording. More detail. I worked and lived in a very large metropolitan area. The first detective was from the police dept. Where I lived. The second detective was from the police dept. Where I worked. I assumed that my story was filed away somewhere and didn't get any notice until they started to hunt down other leads. When I was in first grade, I was playing with a bunch of friends in the woods near their house. There was a hill on one side that ended in the backyards of some other houses. All of a sudden we noticed a man in a Santa Claus outfit just standing at the top of the hill, staring at us. This was particularly odd because it was the middle of summer. We all stared at each other for a minute before he let out a battle cry and came running full speed down the hill at us. We booked it back to my friend's house and ran inside and locked the doors. No idea what happened to Santa. My dad told me a story similar to this except not as climactic. His 3 siblings and 4 cousins were playing outdoor hide and seek at a park. My dad's older sister was counting by the street lamp on the sidewalk when all of a sudden a lady pulls up right behind her and tried to kidnap her. The lady dipped as soon as she saw 7 8-12-year-olds pop out of the bushes running right at her. One of my good friends noticed over the course of a few months that a lot of her bras and underwear had gone missing. Like much more than anyone would expect to just misplace. It continued on for another 6 months or so when she and her husband finally decided to change the locks on their doors. She never had a pair go missing after that. This happened to my brother's GF. They eventually changed the locks too. And it stopped. They still don't know who it was. But my brother said that if he had to guess, he'd say it's that weirdo who lives on the second floor. I mean, he used to go fishing once a week. In his boat. Still on the trailer. In the parking lot. I've posted this story before, but it's definitely up there as one of the creepiest things that's happened to me, so I'll share again here. I was ducking my girlfriend in the backseat of her car out in an abandoned construction site when a white mid-90s Ford Taurus showed up. Car pulled up behind us, put on the high brights, and sat there idling. I put on my underwear and got into the front seat, and then just drove. The ducking car followed us for a good 15 minutes. Finally I found a cop parked for a traffic trap and I just pulled up behind him and parked. The Taurus left, and the cop never bothered to get out of the car to see what was up. Fortunately, neither my girlfriend or I got raped. It was a good night. I was camping with my family one time. We had a large tent that could fit our entire family in it, 6. I awoke one night to the sound of what sounded to be squealing in the distances. I began to freak out thinking something was outside the tent. I waited for a while until it began getting louder. Then the smell came. It was at that moment that I realized someone had let out a very long and very odorous fart. I know this sounds like a joke, and I have noted the serious tag, but it was very scary for an 8-year-old kid to hear what sounded like screaming in the woods. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Biggest comment post yet. Thanks Edit. Thanks kind stranger for the gold. When we were children, my brother once did such a noxious silent fart in the car that my parents actually rolled up the car windows, complaining about the terrible smell from the farm. When I was a kid, about 6 years old, I had a dream about walking through a house I'd never been in before. It was a fairly normal and boring dream. I simply walked from room to room and looked at stuff. Anyway, flash forward to a few months later and our family moves halfway across the country into a new house. On the day we walk in, I immediately recognized it from my dream. It was the exact same house that I had dreamt about months earlier. I told my parents and they essentially laughed it off thinking that I was telling a joke. To this day, it's something that I haven't forgotten about. I have no explanation and more importantly no proof since it was originally all just a dream. But I still swear by the story until this day. I have this same dream very often of a house that is huge that my wife and I own. In the dream, every time I have this dream, I know where everything is, where each room is, etc. In real life I just bought a smaller house, but I'm very convinced that this house plays a big part in my future. I've told this story before on another account and it was pretty high up in the thread, so it might sound familiar to some people. I was a teenager at the time, and laying on the couch one night watching TV. Everyone else was already asleep. Our living room had a big window right behind the TV which looked out to the patio. As I was laying there I suddenly caught, out of the corner of my eye, a man's face pressed right up against the window staring at me with this wide-eyed, crazed expression. I held my panic down surprisingly well, and just sort of calmly got up and walked to my brother's room and got him to look outside to see if anybody was there. And of course there wasn't. In the morning I went out to the patio to see if there were, I dunno, footprints or something. I immediately noticed that the patio table was shoved up against the wall below the window, and there were nose and forehead prints on the glass. For someone to be in the position to make those prints, he would have had to be on top of the table on his hands and knees, with his face pressed against the glass looking at me the night before. Drew Gus, I assume. My mother stopped talking with her father for about 8 years because of previous conflicts. My mother said while she was dreaming, she heard a clear voice tell her to call her father. My mother said she awoken shortly after and had a horrible feeling. She was able to obtain his phone number through other siblings. Turns out he was in a car crash and on life support. He recovered and they were able to rebuild their relationship. When I was a kid my grandparents lived in a split-level house. I used to spend the night there a lot. One time, when I was about 12, I was spending the night. It was late and my grandpa was working and my grandma had to run to the store. I was there alone, laying on the couch downstairs near the base of the stairs. It was summer. Kind of a nice night, and grandma left the front door open with just the screen door closed. After I heard her pull down the driveway, I hear someone walk up the porch steps, across the porch, open the screen door and then run upstairs. The footsteps then ran back down the stairs, stopping for a moment at the landing and then racing down the steps to the family room. I lifted my head expecting to see a family member, but there was nobody. The stairs ended 3 feet from my head and there should have been someone there. But no. I freaked, covered my head with a blanket and stayed like that until grandma got home. Was walking down my street at night. My street is on the outskirts of town and is in a heavily wooded area. It's really like space vacuum quiet. No wind. So I'm walking and the only light is that which is given off by the light pollution in town, so it's dark AF. I start to hear this heavy panting. WTF I think, and my heart starts to race and I get chills. I look behind and about 30 feet away, the farthest I can see in the dark is a squat black silhouette. I'm ducking, freaking the hell out now, and start to run. The silhouette is bounding closer and fast. I dip into the woods and stop behind a dead bush hoping this she doesn't see me. A few seconds later, a huge black dog comes galloping up, drooling, and starts to growl low. I walk up to the dog and start to act real dominant. I tower over it and yell, "Hey, go home." He squeals a bit and sits down, panting still. I approach the dog and firmly pet him. He turns out to be a big sweetie and I go back to the road to finish my joint. Not my story, but my high school art teacher's story. When she was younger, she was walking back to her car after going grocery shopping and a young man approached her asking for to help him put his groceries in his car because he was injured. She politely said she couldn't and gave some excuse. The real reason she said no was because the hairs on the back of her neck stood up and something inside of her was telling her that something wasn't quite right. Well, a few weeks later there's a picture of that man on the news. And that man was none other than Ted Bundy. TLDR, my art teacher was approached by Ted Bundy at a grocery store. Electricity went out while I was in the basement and it was pitch black. I might be old with a family and all, but the electricity going out has always creeped me out. Did you run up the stairs on all fours? This is the only acceptable thing to do. I was once upon a time a wireless engineer for a very big telecom. We worked in facility in Long Island, pretty deep underground. Enough that there is no cell phone coverage. At 1:17 PM exactly, the 50 or so phones we had for testing all rebooted at the same moment. They came back up and started cycling. Over 3 hours we scrambled to find a pattern of some sort. We tried a different network, different FIMODSOL, different phones. No one could come up with an explanation or even a pattern to what caused a particular phone to reboot once every 5 minutes and another to reboot every 45 seconds. At about 430 my boss tells us to clear out. Just come back tomorrow to see what we could do. I get to the Long Island Railroad station and it's a completely clear day, but every train is shown as delayed. I kinda remembered that they were using something involving cell phones for the trains. Speak to the conductor and he confirms that something is up with the computers today. Notice quite a few phones reboot on the train. The next day everything was fine. We never could explain it. Now, I sit here and read about how civilian drones are using cell phone stations and worry. One of my co-workers saw in the comments of one of her friend's Facebook posts that somebody commented and their icon was her picture. But it wasn't her that posted. She found out that this person, a friend of this friend, stole every single one of her Facebook pictures and essentially stole her identity. Like, even the pictures of her mom and sisters. Edit. Words because sleep deprivation cannot properly explain a confusing situation. I had a friend of 8 years who one summer afternoon admitted to me that he works for the CIA. Now, he was 18 at the time and I believed him at first, although in the back of my mind, I thought it sounded a bit strange. Every single time he came back to see me. He always talked about it, and every time I believed him less and less until he was absolutely delusional. Before I ended up not believing him, he told me that he killed people late at night and buried them around the deserts of Las Vegas. Every night he would go down to the CIA and have these assignments to find people to torture people. He had a collection of knives in his room that he used. Once he sent me a picture of what the CIA looked like inside, but I found the same picture on Google Images. Then things got weirder. He would sometimes spy on me and my friends right outside of our houses without saying anything until we found out the next time we saw him. He takes this liquid called B180 to make himself stronger when facing people to kill. He stays awake most of the night. Not tired at all because he has a lot to think about. The last time I saw him, he told me that he has a problem, but he never told me what was wrong with him. Posted this in a similar thread in the past. When I was in middle school, my friends and I were hanging out on a trampoline in the backyard late at night, maybe like 11 PM or so. The backyards are all connecting, meaning there is trees and small fences separating them, but you can walk through them. Some guy comes through and asks if we have seen a little orange stabby cat, and we told him no. He said he lives around the corner, if we see it he will give us a reward. Okay, cool. We think nothing of it and go back to talking about Pokemon cards and why Charizard is a god on paper. No joke. 2 minutes after this guy leaves, this little cat wanders through and we think, is that the cat he was talking about? My friend grabs it and we all proudly march to the guy's house to collect our reward. The guy is sitting on his front porch and we bring the cat to him. He's so excited and says, "Oh, I have the reward inside, just come in and I'll give it to you." We were kinda sketched out, but we decide that to go in and to stay outside. He says, "Oh, if you don't come in I can only give the reward to the ones that come in." He was gonna give $100 a person to go in. Still, we had 2 guys go in and take what felt like forever, but they came out and had $200 with them. They said there was plastic on everything in there and something felt wrong. I feel as though if we all went we would have been killed. But keeping 2 outside that knew where their friends were, I guess, was enough to deter him. Still was a weird occurrence. When I was 4, I had an ongoing obsession with Sully the cat. My family didn't have a cat. Especially not a Siamese. It was purely in my imagination. I drew pictures of Silly, talked to Silly, dreamed of Silly, made a space on my pillow for Silly to sleep on, had empty food dishes on the floor for Silly, and drove everybody ducking mad with Silly. One day we went to a theme park sort of place, and 4 hours straight my parents had to listen to my talk about Silly, how Silly was waiting in a box for me to come get her so we could go home. This is the bit my mum loves to tell. On the way home, my dad cracked. Constant pressure about a make-believe cat. Poor guy had had enough. He began whacking his hand on the steering wheel and yelling, "You want a cat? Well, get a cat. Goddamn." And drove to the shelter on the outskirts of town. So we go into the cat room. And without pause I head straight to a cage in the middle of the row. Point and say, "Yup. They're Silly." There in the cage was a Siamese cat named Cicely, who stayed with us for 16 years. My dad built a little wooden shrine in the flower garden when she passed, and didn't stop moping for months. No one ever believes me when I tell this story, but here goes. So it was my 3rd year in college and I was roommates with a friend I had known from high school. The guy was a little odd. Didn't make friends easily. Made lists constantly. Played video games obsessively, sometimes for 18 hours straight, and talked in his sleep. But he was a fun guy to have around to keep things interesting. So one night I was asleep and dreaming that he and I were on a huge pile of trash looking for something. I woke up and took a leak. When I walked back into the room, he rolled over in bed, still asleep, and said, "I found it. It's over here." Then thrashed and went back to sleep. The next morning he had no memory of it and I know I was awake. I think he was in my mind. So, this happened to a friend of mine while they were on a road trip. They drove past one of those animated billboard with an ad for Facebook on it. The ad contained one of their profile pictures on it. Suffice it to say they both deleted their FB profiles when they got home. Went camping with some friends on hill a few kilometers out in the woods from one of the guy's house. There's a few hiking four-wheeling trails in the area that lead up to the hill, so it's known by the locals. It was about midnight, we had a fire going and were just sitting around having a good time. Then the guy, there was 4 of us, sitting opposite of me, yells, "Who are you?" I turn around and there's this man, about 6 feet tall, staring at us from the edge of the woods with a big rock in his hand. One guy knocked an arrow in the compound bow we had. The guy across from me grabbed the hatchet and I pulled the knife off my belt. We had no clue what we were doing, but the guy wouldn't say anything to us. He eventually just backed into the woods. No sleep was had that night and we kept a very large fire going.